Hey, hello, good evening.
Good evening.
How are you?
Good. I'm cold.
Good. It's very warm. We have not actually been together, just you and I, for a while.
Right.
We've been doing a lot of
Yeah.
interviews, so which is
We
great.
have been. It's nice.
It's a great way to get people's questions answered, is to bring in the experts. I'm just going to shut my phone off so we don't have any interference. Um, but you're cold. Why? You're in their basement. You're cold, or
No,
is it cold there?
we had really nice weather about like a week and a half ago. We were in the 70s and now it's down to the 50s.
Uh,
So,
Bummer.
yeah. And it's like overcast and rainy and not fun.
Well, by the time baby arrives, you will be in very hot weather, so you'll probably wish you was
Yes,
cooler.
right. And I'll be really hot. Yeah. So,
Yeah. So you
yeah.
have some questions.
I do. I thought I'm kind of feeling that end of year burnout. So I thought it would be a great time because the end of the year school year is approaching. And so the kind of overall question is, do you push through or do you pick a date and end no matter what? So that's what I thought we could talk about today.
Right. Okay. Yeah, those are great questions. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
So, more specifically, what do you do when you approach the end of the school year but are behind in the text or curriculum, whatever you're using? Do you double up to get through it all? Do you just kind of push through, or do you set a date and just say, look, this is when we're stopping no matter what we have left, or, you know?
Right. Yeah, I mean, every mom, of course, is going to answer that differently, but in our household, I would say it even got answered differently, each year. And of course, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. So, first of all, if there was just a tiny bit left of a book, I'm probably going to say, why don't we just go until this is done so we could either double up or we could, work a little longer. It's up to you guys. So that would be one option. Of course, it depends on the age of your kids too. Most of my high schoolers wanted to finish a text before the school year, not leave it hanging. But if there was 6 chapters left or 6 modules left or whatever, they might leave it for the following year. When out of the starting gate in September, you're usually more energetic. The moms are usually more energetic, and the kids are, right? Kind of looking
Mm-hmm.
forward to starting up your routine again. So the short answer is it depends. But there has been many times when we have said, actually, I think we've covered enough. And I might, like starting in February or March, I might be thinking, okay, there's no way we're going to get through this science book or whatever before the end of the school year. So I might actually pick and choose the modules or chapters that I think are most valuable for us. And that's fine. I mean, teachers have to do the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I almost always ended at the end of May. So fortunately, books for younger kids often are not set up to be sort of a school year. You know what I mean? As they are for high schoolers, they're more meant to be sort of a September to June time frame. In terms of how much work the kids need to do, but you know, kids' books are usually shorter, and so yeah, lots of times we would maybe start a new book and then say, okay, I'm actually just going to do this, and this chapter out of this, and that's going to wrap it up for this year. So it depends, like just personal question, but what things are you sort of feeling like you either have to quit or push through? What feels to you like you're having to make that decision on?
Me specifically?
Hmm.
Well, and so this is where it's kind of hard for us. Well, on the one hand, we started our oldest with an online curriculum in February.
Right.
So that's as if it was starting, it's the equivalent of starting September, right? It starts from the beginning of the grade, and so
Right.
here we are. We've been doing it, is it a month and a half now? Maybe it's not been that long. And so we've only gotten through a couple chapters from each of those subjects. And so my question really kind of is, do I just stop or
Right.
do I keep him going with it? And then I just feel burnt out, partially just because pregnancy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to be motivated, even if we are doing just very simple things during our
Hmm.
day. You just kind of get to a point where you just, all right, I just don't want to worry about anything like that. Just make sure my kids are fed, clothed, and,
Yeah.
well mannered, and then leave the schooling for the beginning of,
Yeah.
the next year.
And they're learning regardless. Like they're learning in spite of you. I often
Yeah.
think that kids really leap forward in their processing of the stuff they've learned through the school year or the stuff they've just learned because of life. That they often just really leap forward in the summertime because they have time to process it, right? And I think that's so
Hmm.
important. So, I mean, I would definitely tend to be inclined to say, let's just stop. If it's something that builds on itself, like math, sometimes you have to pick sort of an appropriate stopping place. I still feel like I
Sure.
know people who homeschool all year round. I could never do that. I needed the break. I needed the shake up of my routine as well. So,
Hmm.
we have a summer routine, we have a school year routine, but I felt like 2 months wasn't long enough for me. That extra month, finishing at the end of May and, getting outside, getting in the garden, getting to, go places and do things was really, really important to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's, everybody has to take that assessment of their own, take stock of their own, what's going on in their own life. If I was heading into my last trimester of pregnancy, I would absolutely be wrapping it up personally. I had two babies in July. So, yeah, so
Okay.
I get that. And, and it's okay, right? That the thing is you're homeschooling. So it's all okay. Whatever you do is okay.
Yeah.
We do so much science over the summer, that to think that you're not getting enough science done is a ludicrous idea, because summer just lends itself to science because you're outdoors a lot, right?
Right.
And doing all kinds of experimentation and, it just is science. And so I guess with your son, sort of, is it like a 1-year curriculum that he's doing online? I'm bringing this up because I suspect other people are in the same position. Like, we started something new in the middle of the year. What do we do now?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to be so, like to get you through a full school year. And maybe I should have looked closer and prepared myself for this part of the conversation.
Right.
um, it's definitely like chapter based, right? So science started with forces of motion, and now he's on to like life cycles and stuff. And so it
Right.
just kind of keeps breaking it apart, just kind of like you would have the chapters of a science book through, your public school.
Okay.
Um, so, yeah, like on the one hand, it feels like, okay, I could probably just jot down what chapters we haven't finished this year
Yeah.
and then start there next year. Um, uh, and then go ahead.
Just another thing you can do too is, like, if the following year, if he stays with the same program and the following year offers another sort of cyclical type science program, his brain will be that much more developed, and its chances are pretty high that he could probably just go into the science program that the next grade up offers, right? Because
Sure.
they're geared towards a developing brain. So it's not like in science in particular, there's probably not that many things that he must know in order to move on to the next, to the next phase, right? If it's too hard, you could always bump back. I'm assuming you can do that. You could choose what grade you want to be doing.
Right.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other thing I think about, well, two things that kind of crossed my mind when I was kind of thinking about when are we going to end this year.
Right.
One being, because I wasn't homeschooled and I wasn't home when my siblings were homeschooled, I've never seen what this looks like, and
Right.
I think we've always, homeschooled and done sort of a formal homeschooling education. But for some reason this year feels different in terms of when do we stop.
Right.
And so I kind of looked back at my own education growing up in parochial schools or Catholic schools, and we never finished any of the books. Any of the grade school books, they're like an inch or two thick.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got things like snow days or rambunctious classes, you know, where it's just the
Yeah.
teachers don't get through. Maybe we'd get through half of a book.
Yeah. And the teacher just has to make that call. What do they think is the most important? And I've had that conversation with my own kids over and over again, you know, that I'm not going to finish this, last 3 modules, or I'm never going to finish this book this year. Well, you can either do them next year, or you can pick and choose what modules you think are the most valuable for you. Right? A teacher has to do that. Same thing when in my schooling, there was lots of times when, sections were skipped over. Actually, we're going to skip this section because you guys don't really need it, or we think this one's more important, or whatever. And that's perfectly okay, right?
Yeah. Sure.
So in terms of, so, it really depends. And if you want to push through, sometimes that really kills the enjoyment of something. Sometimes not. It depends how hard you have to push, right? But getting towards that end of the year is often not the time to push through, because kids are tired. They're looking forward to kind of getting out and doing something different. You're looking forward to, especially right now, because you're pregnant, and so it's often not the time. So sometimes if you're not going to make it through a book, and we don't always know what life's going to hand us, but if it's January and you think, oh, we're not going to finish this, that's the time to either sort of make the decision of pushing through or skipping things.
Sure.
Right. And, it takes, some years of experience before you realize that that's kind of where you need to be with it. Or sometimes even at the very beginning of the year, we're actually going to just make a decision. We're just going to here. Right. Or we're skipping, X, Y, and Z chapters.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then I think the other thing I try and think about is how much of my grade school learning, I'm speaking grade school just because that's the age of my kids.
Yeah.
But there's very little I remember from what I learned in grade school, and so here we've talked about this before, where you're just trying to check off the boxes, right? Mm-hmm. Like, make sure you've taught this and that they've learned this. And in reality, until I went through it again with my son a couple weeks ago, I did not remember the definition of a simile or an antonym or, like any of these grammatical terms.
Yeah.
Like I can use proper grammar, but I couldn't define these things, right?
Yeah, most of us can't.
Yeah, and so here I'm trying to like drill in with my kids, okay, remember this, and yet I don't. And so it's kind of teaching me to be a little bit gentler. Yeah. More gentle?
Yeah.
Maybe I don't know grammar.
You were just giving us an example.
Right.
It is one of those things, like I learned so much the first couple of times through homeschooling my kids, saying goodbye and doing dictation or doing science or doing math or whatever. And I thought, wow, there was so much of this that I did not retain, and so it really makes it clear to us that what's important is we teach them how to learn and to love learning. Those are what really, really matters. Because if they end up going into English, say they become really jazzed about English and they want to be a writer, they're going to learn all those things. They're going to relearn them.
Sure.
And then they're going to retain them because they're relevant. But we want to expose them to all these beautiful things and all the terms. It's just cool knowing that the different parts of language have different names, right? And there's sometimes very, very specific names for the way we use words. That's cool to know that. And so that's in their head. Okay, there's this thing, and there's all these names for the different ways we use language. And one day I might need to know that again. And great.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this may not be relevant, but I feel like sharing it. My neighbor actually recently lent us a movie. It's an old John Wayne movie called Cowboys. Have you ever seen it or heard of it? And so she said, your boys will love it. I mean, she sees them out playing all the time. And so we sat down and watched it over 2 nights with the kids. And I will warn people, there was some language. So if you plan on renting it, just be warned. But it was really cool. The whole premise is John Wayne has to do a cattle drive. Right. And I didn't pick up, I think maybe he's in Montana. somewhere kind of west or northwest area.
Right.
But all of his, farmhands leave for like gold mining. Like there was gold supposedly, and they all
Right.
wanted to check it out.
Right.
So he was left with the schoolboys in town who were, 10 to 13, and they all wanted to do it. And so this movie was about how he taught them and how they went on this cattle drive.
No
And
way.
it was really cool to see what they learned on the way, like not only practical stuff, but character building stuff and, just teamwork and all these kinds of things that we kind of forget to teach our kids.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to fill their brains with all this good education, but then maybe not so much all this other stuff. At least that's how it is in my home. Like my husband and I have had conversations where how can we help teach them, to be generous with their time and not always just like, they're young, so they're going to take a lot more than they're going to give, but there's also ways to teach and encourage growth in those areas that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, when you stop doing, whatever sit down work sort of you do with your kids, what an invitation to do that sort of thing, right? To, kind of focus more. And the thing is, those things are always kind of on our mind, and they're not necessarily part of the curriculum, but they should be. And so, you never stop educating your kids if you have the right mindset. And so, but it doesn't have to feel like work,
Right.
It can just feel like life, because there's so many beautiful moments in any given day that can, lead to education, whatever that is, And again, I think it's one of those things like write it down. If you're doing something very specific over the summer, or even just anecdotally at the end of summer, think, wow, my son really grew in his ability to share with his siblings. Right.
Yeah.
He got lots of practice. We were outdoors a lot. And so people were in better mood. So we really capitalized on that. And you might not be intending to do any of that, but it's kind of a nice way to sort of see what actually happened over the summer. I mean, gardening, just as an example, right? I mean, last year, the gardening happens from, May to October, most of that time being, summertime. And, so much education, for me, for my daughter, for my grandkids, just so much education about how things grow and how we help them grow and how we benefit from them, growing them and, all the things that we talk about when you're just puttering in the garden,
Right.
So yeah, so many opportunities. So we can just I think we just need to not think of it as, okay, well, I'm stopping now, therefore I'm doing nothing, because we're never doing nothing. That's just not an option, right? When you got kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So if you do stop before you've finished whatever curriculum, do you recommend starting from where you left off, or just kind of clean slate and, just plan for the new year regardless of where you left off? Or does it vary, as you had mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree it would vary. I would say that would be very age dependent. So for my own kids, when they were young, I would be inclined to just, I feel like I like to take a topic and kind of run with it until they're saturated. Okay. So say we're doing the human body and they're super into it, and we spend 6 weeks just diving into the human body and everything there is to know about it. I want to run with that. As soon as they start showing signs of like, it's getting tedious, I would tend to wrap that up. Right.
Okay.
And so that might be 6 weeks. It might be 6 months. Right. So, I think I've shared this story before, but I was doing Canadian history with my kids. This is the first time I went through Canadian history. So I had little kids. And we got through to about November doing Canadian history. It was really fun. And, reading books that were set in historic Canada, and, built our curriculum around that. And then we got to November and we started talking about the slaves that would escape to Canada to freedom, right, on the Underground Railroad.
Mhm.
And so we read a book called The Underground Railroad. So we read that book, and the kids were really, really fascinated with it, and fascinated with the idea that anyone could think they owned or were superior to another human being. That was just, that idea was like, what? How can people think that? So we read another book, and then we read another book. We ended up spending the entire rest of the year studying slavery, right? And the history of
Mhm.
slavery, and, just totally, that's all we did, because they were so into it, right? So Canadian
Mhm.
history, not that it got tedious, it's just that their minds got, you know, embroiled in something else, and they really, really wanted to run with that, right? So I
Mhm.
think that we have to always be sensitive about that as parents, especially with things like social studies and science, because they don't have to be learned in a particular order. We don't have to do the human body this year and the, plants and trees next year, and bodies of water another year. We don't have to do it that way. We can do it any way we want.
Mhm.
Including, we can look at big, big, big picture things. Like, this is all of science. We're doing all of science. I'm going to expose you a little bit this year to all the different areas of science. But if your kids suddenly are super into astronomy, you're gonna want to run with that. So that might
Yeah.
be that you don't get some other aspect of your science book done. So I would say, in much as possible, sort of soak them for what you can get, because kids learn when they're interested. And so
Mhm.
if that means you put aside the science book and you go to the library and you get 6 more books on astronomy, great, right?
Mhm.
So I would have a tendency, when my kids were younger, for sure. And I would say, when I say younger, I often mean sort of 12 or 13 or younger. I'm not talking about little wee kids. That I would tend to just go with their interest level, and then stop when I felt like I needed to stop for the school year. So, yeah, I know that's kind of a complicated answer to a relatively simple question. you know,
Well,
um,
it, it's interesting because here we're talking about wrapping up the end of the year, and I'm finding I have a question about in the middle of the year, because you've given like timelines, right? Where
mhm.
you might spend 6 weeks on a topic or 6 months on a topic. And so what I'm wondering is that you spend an hour every day of the week for 6 months, or is it one day a week you focus on this subject? You know, does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, so again, that would be very dependent on their interest level, right? So, if you can sort of, if I give you a bit of a snapshot, we're sitting around the kitchen table. I'm reading to them about Vikings. They're really, really into it. I'm reading our novel, and then we might read, a couple of other books about Vikings, the encyclopedias, or some eyewitness books, or whatever tools we have in our toolbox about Vikings. And maybe we do that for 20 minutes. And maybe we do it for an hour and a half. It just depends how into it they are on any particular day, right? So I'm going to
Okay.
aim to read at least a chapter of our book, and then maybe a little bit more from a nonfiction book about the topic that we're currently studying. So, you know, I would say I just kind of let that roll out the way it's going to roll out, right? But I would have kind of a minimum of what I'd want to do, which might be 15 or 20 minutes by the time I've read a chapter and read a bit more. Obviously in the winter months, we get a lot more reading done. This not the interest of going outside, and so this is kind of the main thing we're interested in is really getting into these stories, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so again, just very dependent, and I'm just tend to want to just let them run with it for as long per day as they want to, and as long
Okay.
per the school year as they want to, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're going to have a whole episode about that.
Okay. Did we do an episode early on about using how to read a book so it becomes the curriculum?
I know we've talked about it because you
Okay.
did write a book on it.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to maybe be very specific, and maybe you've told your story about your kids being interested in studying slavery,
Yeah.
and learning about that, and so maybe we could even use that as a springboard
Yeah. It would
to
actually
kind of
be interesting to
assist.
do a later topic, because because then it would have a larger range of age of kids, right? And
Sure.
so how does that work with the little ones? Again, now here's something, worth saying. I think that when you're doing this with your kids, if the little ones walk away and they're saturated, they're 4, 5, 6, 7, that's okay, because you're going to revisit the topic, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if they want to stay and, play and, play with toys or play with Play-Doh or something while we're sitting at the table, great. But if they wandered away, I wasn't worried about that, because I know I'm going to revisit it. I'm not going to keep a disinterested 7-year-old sitting there while I'm reading something that really is grabbing more the 10 and 12-year-olds, um,
Right.
and then sometimes we're studying something, we're talking about a family dynamic here. So not everybody's interested in the same thing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to be able to sort of pull things in that you can, but, sometimes you have to be sort of negotiating a little bit. It's like, I'm going to read this book. I know it's probably not going to be your favorite topic, but then when I'm done this book, I'm going to read this one, which I think you'll really like. So, and in terms of the studying of things, if they wanted to say, them to write a paragraph on something, they're totally free to choose what they want to write the paragraph on. And usually it's going to be, I'll just use Vikings as the, sort of example. But so for the boys, that might be the weapons, or one of the kids might really be interested in the ships and warfare of Vikings. Somebody else might be super interested in the way they raise their children, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can choose what they want. And, if they're learning how to write, and that's what I really want, if they said, can I just write, I just want to write about my sewing project. Well, whatever. Yeah, fine. Learning to write is learning to write. You don't have to write about what we're necessarily learning. Right? So,
Yeah. I think maybe the reason I'm having a hard time grasping how this works is because I only have one whose interest is still held for extended periods of time
yeah,
on topics in history or science, whatever. The others are 6, 4, and 2, and so
yeah,
they're going to be
exactly.
there for maybe 2 minutes.
Well, and I'll tell you something that, okay, so right now, where you're at right now, was probably when I really started to get rolling with this idea, like over the next, couple of years from kind of this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and also you can bring in things like, if we do an episode on this, I'll talk a lot more about this, but you can bring in things like, for the little kids, you can bring in a storybook about the same topic, so that really grabs their attention and can kind of pull them into the larger story of what you're talking about. But you just,
Mm-hmm.
they take in what they take in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry for that tangent. I was just very curious. um, okay. So then moving on, what if you and your spouse don't agree on when to stop? So say your husband or wife wants to, stop on May 10th,
Right.
but the other says, no, you should finish this, and this book before you stop. So
Right.
how do you kind of work through that and find common ground and communicate?
Right. Okay. So I was in the very fortunate position of my husband just letting me have free reign with how I wanted to homeschool, because I had really, really clear ideas of what I wanted it to look like. And he was sort of, certainly when we started, he was sort of like, well, I don't know, why do you want to homeschool? Now he's, a big fan. But, back in the early, the first year or two, he just thought, why? Like, why would you do that? And so, yeah, so I had a lot of freedom, I would say. Then that discussion didn't come up very often where he thought I should do a certain thing. The odd time, like, I'll just share a story. Albert really enjoyed learning, like memorizing all the prime ministers of Canada. When he was a kid. To him, that was really, really interesting. Well, I can't think of anything more boring that I would want to do with me or with my kids. And so, but I wasn't against it, but I wasn't going to teach it because I didn't think it had a lot of value. And so, this came up and he had mentioned it a few times. And I said, well, if you want them to know that, yeah, take it on, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that would be my inclination, is if you think they should really, really do this, I'm burned out. And in order for me to continue homeschooling, I'm going to have to take care of myself, and I'm going to have to have a break. And that's going to have to start now. But if you want to do that with them, great, and be encouraging. Like, that can be, you know, I mean, you're doing this together, right? And so I think that it's really important if there's differences of opinions about how it should roll out. Presumably, you've made the decision to homeschool together. You know that
Right.
that this is something I'm going to need you to take on. You know, I mean, I guess you could make a comparison that, say, one spouse really loves, you know, gourmet food and loves to cook, and the other spouse just likes simple cooking. That, you know, if you can't expect one spouse to learn how to be a gourmet cook when it's not their strength, their desire, if it's draining for them, if it's going to exhaust them in other areas of their life. And so, you know, you could say, you know, if you want to eat like that, that's great. I totally encourage you to do that, but I can't do it, right? And that
Right.
will have to be your thing that you do.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
that would be my suggestion, anyways. If there's differences of opinions, you know, and sometimes the difference of opinion is a little bit different than that. And this has happened. You know, I've heard this type of thing quite often in my sort of career of you know, talking with parents and encouraging parents, where say the husband is not really totally sold on homeschooling, and the wife wants to homeschool, and what ends up happening is that he says, well, you're not doing enough, right? You're not doing enough. So then it's a bit different, because then you can't really pass it off if they're not really in agreement with this. Then you can't really pass it off very easily. You know, so that's something that, of course, you know, you have to find ways to communicate, you know, what the problems are. And then maybe that's ramping back to a whole other thing. I mean, that's really a marital issue, not really a homeschooling issue. You know, how can we get past this big difference of opinion about whether we homeschool the kids or not, really? So yeah, does that
Yeah.
give some answers to the questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, then I have maybe one more question. And that is, you know, we've talked about the idea of mom guilt before.
Yeah.
So how, and I'm sure this won't be the last time, how do you deal with the potential guilt of ending the year before and I put this in quotes, the book is finished, right? So before
Right.
you've really officially ended whatever specific books you're working through, you know?
Right. Well, I think I think that, first of all, you should focus on what you did do, not what you didn't do, right? So I think that's one way that we can sort of move past mom guilt. I also think that you can just take a note of it. If I want to come back to this, I can. These are the chapters we didn't finish. Put that in your notes and put the book away, right? Just put it away. Don't have it sitting there if you know that you keep feeling like, oh, I should have gone back to that. And you could also remind yourself that whatever you did, you obviously did it, right? You dived into it, maybe even to the point where you didn't finish the book because you were spending time doing this, right? So really focus on what you did accomplish. You know, I know I've talked about record keeping off and on, but it's just write down the things you do. Take pictures of the things you do, all of them, because sometimes we can finish a week or a month and think, I didn't do anything. And yet, when you think about all the conversations you had, all the books you read, all the you know, things you might have watched together, or virtual or actual field trips that you had, including, you know, going to your friend's house and, you know, finding clay in the backyard or whatever it is you did, you know, be really aware of that, because we don't need reasons to beat ourselves up. That's just a human condition to be doing that all the time. And so, you know, allow yourself the freedom to say, you know what, we accomplished a lot, and I'm not going to look at what I didn't do. I'm going to, so if you know, if the book's an inch thick and a quarter inch isn't done, you did 3/4 of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what I would say. So is that it for questions?
Yeah, that's all I have.
All
I don't know if
right.
you wanted to
That's a
tag
great
on
topic.
anything else.
Nothing that pops into my mind, although I do think having a session just on an episode just on how to read a book so it becomes the curriculum would be good. Even if we've done it before, it's probably worth doing again, because it's such a good topic, and I think that it really helps us to develop that comfort level of not checking off the boxes,
Yeah.
And just letting it roll out the way it does, and allowing the learning that should happen that particular year with those particular people happen,
Yeah.
and there's just so much value in that, right? Is sort of relaxing about the boxes, and instead tracking what they do, right?
Right.
So creating boxes, I guess, is kind of the way we need to look at that. Creating boxes instead of having ones that we check off, right? So,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
what a life, eh? So just want to remind people you're welcome to submit questions. We are doing a lot more interviews now than we ever imagined. But we still really appreciate your questions, and submit them either to my Facebook page, Make Joy Normal, or on my website. My email is there, or via message on Instagram. I get a lot of questions that way too. So, and don't forget, if you're a listener to this podcast, please share the episode if it got you all excited about something, or don't forget to what's the word? Subscribe. That's the word. Subscribe to the podcast, because that gets it out to more people, because it gets more attention with the more subscribers we have. So, and thank you all for your listeners and the beautiful comments that we get every single day, almost every week for sure. Just beautiful comments from people about how the podcast has affected their life. So we are delighted to hear what impact we've had on you. So God bless and good night. And
Thank you.
we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.